was Albert Einstein, Chapter 5. Albert hits high gear. If A equals success, then the formula for if A equals success, then A equals X plus Y plus Z. X is work, Y is play, Z is keeping your mouth shut. Albert Einstein. Ay, ay, ay. In 1913, a famous university offered to pay Albert more money than he had ever made before, and all he had to do was come to the school and think. He would teach only when he felt like it. It was a dream come true, almost. The one drawback was that the university was in Berlin, Germany. Although it had been nearly 20 years since Albert had lived in Germany, he hadn't forgotten his awful high school years. And Albert's wife, Mileva, didn't like Berlin or the people there. She thought they were mean and unfriendly. Mileva was also jealous of Albert's success. She was a brilliant scientist, but the world only cared about Albert. The more she thought about it, the less she wanted to leave Zurich and their many friends. Albert had made a decision. He would go off to Berlin and think, or stay in Zurich and be a good husband. Albert had to make a decision. Would he go off to Berlin and think, or stay in Zurich and be a good husband and father? Albert needed brilliant people around him who could help him think about his ideas. At the time, scientists said only a dozen men in the world understood relativity, and 8 of them lived in Berlin. Albert remembered his hikes through Italy, and the promises he had made to himself. He decided to go to Berlin. Albert left Mileva and their 2 children behind in Switzerland. Albert once admitted, "I treat my wife as an employee whom one cannot fire." It was not surprising that Mileva and Albert soon got divorced. Thereafter, Albert had little to do with her or their 2 sons. Years later, when Albert won the Nobel Prize in 1922, he sent the prize money to Mileva and their sons. Perhaps this made him feel less guilty for having abandoned his family. Albert's oldest son, Hans Albert, grew up to become a distinguished science professor in California. Occasionally, he visited his father, Edward, born in 1910. The younger son, whom Albert named Tittle, which means little bear, was gifted in music and literature, but suffered from mental illness. After his mother's death, Edward lived in a hospital for the rest of his life. Albert once congratulated his son Hans Albert, whose birthday he never remembered, for being just like himself when he came to family. "It is a joy for me to have a son who has inherited the main trait of my personality, the ability to rise above mere existence by sacrificing oneself through the years for an impersonal goal. This is the best, indeed only way in which we can make ourselves independent from personal fate and from other human beings." Albert never questioned his decision to choose scientific discovery over family. Albert and the Tube. In 1922, Albert won the Nobel Prize, the most important award a scientist can ever win, for the thinking he did about the photoelectric effect. Albert's thinking about the photoelectric effect then led to the invention of TV. You can thank Albert for the boob tube. As for moving to Berlin, Mileva had good reason for not wanting to live in Germany. In the early 1900s, the countries of Europe were struggling with each other for power. Some countries had lots of land but little money. Many people were not allowed to worship as they wished. Some countries had large populations but weak armies. They all wanted what the other had, and they were willing to fight for it. The tensions grew and grew. There was so much hatred, Europe felt like it was going to burst. Germany was one of the scariest countries. The government wanted to build the most powerful army in the world to get rid of all of Germany's enemies. When Albert arrived in 1914, Berlin was full of German soldiers that were training, armed, and eager for war. It was a very uncomfortable place for a peace-loving Albert to live. But one person in Berlin, Albert's cousin Elsa, made life more pleasant. And Elsa was full of affection for Albert. They started to spend a lot of time together. Elsa soon fell in love with Albert, the man, not the scientist. As far as Albert was concerned, he and Elsa were a much happier match than Albert and the challenging Mileva. Soon the couple announced they were going to get married. Elsa took care of Albert, which was good because Albert certainly didn't. He was ever more careless about getting enough sleep and eating properly. Albert's doctors said of him, "As his mind knows no limits, so his body follows. No set rules. He sleeps until he's wakened. He stays awake until he's told to go to bed. He will go hungry until he is given something to eat, and then he eats until he is stopped." So he didn't have a lot, even though he was really smart, he didn't know how to limit himself and have self-control. Elsa looked after him, making sure Albert got up on time, got dressed, and ate his breakfast. Life with his second wife suited Albert very well. However, it is an interesting fact that Albert's very best scientific thinking was done during his marriage to Mileva. Perhaps that doesn't mean anything, or perhaps, as some critics say, his greatest theories might really be their greatest theories, or even her great theories. Some publications, even Time magazine, which proclaimed Albert Einstein Person of the Century in December 31st, 1999 issue, wondered exactly what Mileva may have contributed to her husband's scientific ideas. An Einstein thought. Albert claimed that space is curved. That's why a ray of light, instead of traveling forever in a straight line, might even return to where it started. Think about it. You're 4 years old, and you're out in the yard. You shine a light into the sky. 10 years later, you're 14, mowing the lawn, and blam, the same light smacks you in the eye. Surprise! Because it curved through the universe. In 1914, Europe finally burst. The weak political agreements that had kept countries out of wars collapsed. World War I erupted, and Germany's great armies facing France, Russia, and England, and quickly winning many battles. Wars run on hate, drain countries of food and money, and caused the deaths of many. Albert hated the war. He hated all wars. This war also brought up particular frustration for Albert. He had hoped to prove his theory of curving light through photos of the 1914 eclipse. Just as German citizens were setting up cameras in Russia, war broke out. Germany and Russia were now enemies. The Russians arrested the German scientists and destroyed their equipment. The eclipse passed with no photos. It would be another 5 years before Albert could have a chance to photograph another total eclipse. The combined forces of Russia, France, and England eventually slowed and stopped the German victory. The war became a stalemate. Year after year, neither side could gain clear victory over the other. The supplies needed to fight the long war drained Germany of its money, food, and fuel, and meanwhile thousands of German soldiers died each day. German leaders kept insisting that the war would end in their favor. They ordered the country's best scientists to say that, yes, indeed, Germany was doing a great job fighting the war. Albert refused to make such a statement. He said, "Never do anything against conscience, even if the state demands it." and he meant it. The German government was furious with Albert. It wanted to put Albert and his ridiculous head of hair into jail. But Albert was lucky. He was still a citizen of Switzerland. It was difficult for the Germans to imprison someone from another country, especially a peaceful one like Switzerland. Germany finally lost the war in 1918. Albert had managed to stay out of jail. More than ever, Albert was committed to promoting peace. In the following year, 1919, there was going to be a full eclipse, the first since the one in 1914 that didn't get photographed. It was step up or shut up. Step up or shut up time for Albert and his theory of bending light. Many scientists in Germany hoped that Albert would be proven wrong. Then perhaps all his other theories could be wrong too. Before the eclipse, cameras were set up in 2 locations, one in South America and one in the Isle of the coast off West Africa. There were 2 cameras in case clouds suddenly moved in and blocked the eclipse in one place. That way, there was still a chance to get photos of the other location. The cameras were pointed at the sun. Ordinarily, the intense sunlight made it impossible to see or photograph the movement of light as it passes the sun and planets. But then the moon moved in between the sun and the earth. It blocked the sun's brightness, and suddenly the light not seen before could be photographed. The cameras clicked. Once the photographs were developed, Albert was sure they would show the light bent as it passed the sun and other planets. On November 7, 1919, the news was announced. Albert was right. Light did bend. Although very few people understood what Albert Einstein was talking about, the whole world recognized that he was a genius. Suddenly, Albert was a superstar. A tobacco company even introduced a new product, the Einstein cigar. And then within a year of the eclipse, over 100 books and articles about Albert were published. Now, 80 years later, the number of books and articles about Albert is in the thousands. All of the fuss may sound wonderful, but to Albert it meant losing his treasured privacy. The attention Albert wrote to a friend was so bad that I can barely breathe, let alone get down to any sensible work. He was the first genius superstar. Albert made the best of his uncomfortable situation. Because of his growing fame, he could have become rich by appearing on radio shows, making speeches, and writing books. A London theater offered Albert as much money as he wanted if Albert would appear on stage with fire eaters and tightropes. So they wanted him to be in kind of like a circus-like show. Walkers. Albert's act would be explaining his theories, but Albert said no. Instead of making money, he wanted to use his influence to make the world a better place. For Albert, that meant a world without war.